everyone, welcome back to Rolling Solo. My name is Adam Smith. I'm back from Gen Con, and we already have Zombicide Green Horde set up here. I'm really excited. We're going to be doing the rules overview in this one. So what we're going to do in order to change it up this time around is, instead of doing a typical rules overview where I would basically cover all the general high-level rules before we move into the playthrough, what we're going to do to make things more interesting and more useful for you guys, the viewer, is we're going to talk more so about the changes or additions that this Zombicide Green Horde expansion or standalone game essentially is adding into the Zombicide universe versus actually talking about every single rule. Most of us have played either one of the variations of Zombicide, which involves moving, attacking, opening doors, taking down different types of monsters. So there's no point in going through the overall rules because there are a lot of videos out there that cover that already. I think what's the most useful is to cover what has added in or changed rules-wise in Green Horde from, say, Black Plague. So we're going to do that in this video, and that way we can get closer to the, or faster into the playthrough. So just so you guys are aware as well, I have made some modifications to the spawn deck to balance it out a little bit more. I'll talk more about that in the first part of the playthrough. We'll ignore that for this video. I also want to make mention we are playing with the 4 Stranger Things characters. We are missing one of the Stranger Things characters, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the actual playthrough. But besides that, I think it's time to dive into what's changed and what is new within this version of Zombicide. So first up, let's talk about orc walkers, and that's what these are right here. There's actually 5 different model or miniature types in terms of the look of them. Of course, they're all the same. They're all considered orc walkers, but there's just different designs and different looks and feel to these different orcs. So there's going to be a little bit of learning there as to the differentiation between the orc walkers and the orc runners. Both of those sometimes can be confused, so it is useful at times to use bases, clip-on bases if you can get them, for the runners. Everything you're seeing here is an orc walker. The only difference from the prior Black Plague version is that these are basically your standard zombie walkers, except they're now going to deal 2 damage when they attack instead of just 1. Next up, we have the orc fatties. So like the orc walkers we just talked about, these are upgraded fatties and deal 3 damage when they attack. They still take 2 damage in order to be destroyed though. Next up, we have the orc runners. These guys are nasty. Thankfully, there have been no changes to the runners in the Zombicide Green Horde version of this game. They get 2 activations, and this isn't mentioned at all actually in the rulebook, but it shows up elsewhere inside the rulebook. So they do still get the 2 activations that everyone's used to, which can be a move, a move attack, or a double attack. It depends on where they are in relation to the survivors or heroes that they're basically trying to attack or run after. The one biggest difference with these guys, you're going to notice that they look very, very similar to the orc standard walkers. So once you get a few of those standard walkers in a room, it then becomes a little difficult sometimes off the hop to determine which ones are the runners. So either through painting, either through clip-on bases, maybe a quick mark on the base itself, or a sticker, you might be able to differentiate some of these models, and it's likely that that's a very good idea if you're not planning on painting them. Next up, you have things like the Orc Abomination. This guy is somebody you do not want to run into. You want to take this guy down at the first opportunity. Not much has changed here in terms of abominations. Of course, this one's an orc, so it's the standard abomination within Zombicide Green Horde. There are crazy amounts of other abominations that will add a bunch of new gameplay elements you'll have to learn as you go. But we're not going to talk about each of those here because there is a ton of them. But typical orc abominations, which is the one you're seeing right here, this version, which is the standard one in the base game, they deal 3 damage and they require 3 damage weapons to be destroyed or killed, and they also ignore armor. They can also be defeated with a Dragonfire, of course, or the Trebuchet, which is this nasty thing back here, which is going to be really useful for clearing these guys out. Lastly, we have the wonderful Necromancers. This is what made Black Plague so cool, with the ability for Necromancers to come onto the board, bringing a spawn point that's specific to them onto the board, and them trying to escape to an alternate or totally different spawn point that's the closest in range, and then all of a sudden it would solidify that new spawn point that came in. These guys are nasty, and if you don't take care of them, they can really make your life miserable. In Zombicide Green Horde, the typical Green Horde Necromancers, or the Orc Necromancers as they're referred to, they've gotten beefed up just like a few of the orcs we've already mentioned. You can tell that the strength on these things have gone up. So like the rest of them we've already mentioned that some of their attacks have gone up, the Necromancer also goes up to dealing 2 damage to you when it attacks, which is pretty nasty. Now let's talk about a really cool game mechanic that comes through with Green Horde, and that is the Horde itself. This is a new spawning mechanic inside of Zombicide Green Horde, and basically there's an off-the-map tile or area which you're going to place zombies that are building up and could basically be released at any time based on the spawn cards given or resolved. So you can see here we have a tile that represents the area where the Horde will form. This was and came with the Kickstarter exclusives as well, so if you didn't get the Kickstarter you won't have this tile, but don't worry, you don't need the tile in order to keep your horde of zombies off to the side of the map. They basically just come in to whichever spawn point the card that gets flipped is related to. So in other words, what we'll do here is we're going to take an example of one of the cards so you guys can understand how you typically spawn to a tile like this one for the Horde. So if you're going through a typical spawn, when you want to spawn for this location here, you're going to go ahead and grab a card like this, which would normally come from that deck up there, and you're going to flip it over. If you get a card like this that says Assemble the Horde, you'll notice that there's a banner here in the top left. That means you're assembling the Horde, so there's definitely no way you can miss it. You'll also notice there's these hexagons along the sides, and they basically just say how many zombies of a particular type that are referenced here will be put inside of the Horde area after you're done. Of course, it depends on what level of XP your highest survivor is at. So currently, for me, I'd be at blue because all of my current survivors haven't even gotten a single XP yet. So I'd be going ahead and spawning one orc walker into this location right here. So I would go ahead and take this orc walker, for instance, and drop him right here. But on top of that, you'd also then take another walker because of the fact it has the +1 there, and you'd add this to the Horde. And that's how the Horde is going to be built up. So you're not only dealing with spawns that are adding to the game board itself, but there's this massive pile of zombies that will sit over here, and at a certain point, there will be a spawn card that will say, trigger the Horde, and this Horde will move to that particular spawn point, causing mass chaos across the map. In other situations when resolving a spawn and pulling one of these cards, you may find a card that says the Orc Necromancer. Now, if this is the case, you're going to obviously go ahead and spawn the Orc Necromancer, plus you're going to be going ahead and putting the spawn zone for that Necromancer out. All Necromancers that already are on the board are going to get an extra activation, so you're going to trigger that. But down here is what I really want to focus on. For Green Horde, this is what would be new and extra. You can see again the banner is there, which signifies the Horde, and you're going to be adding a walker, a fatty, and a runner to the Horde, making this area even more nasty than it currently is. So as you can see right now, we have a standard walker in there. We'd be going ahead and adding an extra standard walker. We're going to go ahead and grab a runner, making sure we've actually grabbed a miniature that represents a runner. And as I've talked about before, sometimes that's confusing, so it would be good to denote the ones that are runners, as it can get a little bit tricky. And then we also have a fatty that will join us. And then at this point, we've now spawned all the necessary individuals into the Horde tile or Horde area for this particular Necromancer card. At some point during your playthroughs of Green Horde, you're going to get a card that you may not want to see that often, called Enter the Horde. This is going to be a trigger to bring every miniature that's currently contained within the Horde area. It's going to basically be placed in the zone of which you pulled this card for. So if we pulled this card for this spawn, then this entire Horde here would be dropped into this area. You'll also see down here it says don't spawn more zombies in the building. The spawn step ends here. So if this card was being pulled inside of a building, so for instance if we had a building that was actually quite large like this one here with 2, if we happen to pull this spawn card and we were resolving this room, because in Zombicide you're able to pick and choose which room you want to resolve a card for first. If we chose this one or this one, it wouldn't really matter, because in this particular case this card would have come up and essentially it would have brought the entire Horde from this tile into one of these rooms, whichever room we had decided in advance of pulling the card that we wanted to spawn for. And then these guys would land in that room. And then this room here would not be resolved for, as the bottom of the card says, to go ahead and stop spawning zombies in the building. And this whole spawn step, even more importantly, ends right there, which means if you still have other spawn points to trigger, those don't trigger anymore, because you've essentially, for balance, unleashed a massive Horde that's already going to cause chaos within the world. The next major addition for Zombicide Green Horde is the trebuchet. That's this monstrosity here on the board, and it's a good thing. This is something that's going to help out the heroes or survivors. The trebuchet is not an actor. It obviously has its own set of rules, which we'll talk quickly about right now. So in order to perform a siege action, a survivor is going to have to spend some of their actions, and there's a number of different things that you can do on your turn in order to interact or use the trebuchet. The first thing you can do on your turn, if you're in the same location as the trebuchet, is use a full action cost of 3 action points, which is literally your entire turn, and the survivor and the trebuchet both move from a zone to the next zone. This action is used as a standard move action, so rules are going to apply, but it does not benefit from the additional skills and game effects related to move actions. So this is going to be a straight up one move, burn your entire turn. So I could move the trebuchet along with this one individual to this location right here if I wanted to. One thing to note that is a trebuchet can be just automatically destroyed whenever it's set in a water zone. You remove the entire miniature from the game. So there may be a situation where the trebuchet ends up in one of these water holes positions. If it does, the trebuchet is completely destroyed and taken off of the game board. Another action that survivors can use is, of course, firing the trebuchet. That's very, very useful. You spend all 3 of your action points again to actually fire the trebuchet. The survivor then loads and fires it, aiming it at a zone at range 2 or more. No line of sight is required, so you can shoot through buildings, you can shoot over stuff. You don't have to worry about the line of sight requirements within the game. Of course, firing a trebuchet is explained in more depth within the combat rules of the rulebook on page 35 if you want to learn more about it. But basically, firing the trebuchet is quite an experience and is quite fun within Zombicide Green Horde, as you're able to wipe out multiple units more easily. Another thing to note is that firing a trebuchet does not produce noise, so there will be no noise token put down when the trebuchet fires. Now that we know on your turn that you can fire the trebuchet, let's talk about the different types of options you have when firing the actual trebuchet and using your 3 actions. So when you use those 3 actions, you're going to go ahead and load and fire. There's multiple different ways you can actually shoot. So first you're going to designate the zone on the board that you're attacking. It has to be at range 2 or further. So I could actually, from this zone here, I could easily hit this zone full of zombies. No issues there. Next, you're going to choose your ammunition type. That's right, the trebuchet has multiple ammunition types. It's not just a standard shot. You actually have one called scatter shot, where you get to roll up to 6 dice, and all you need to get is an accuracy of 4 or higher, so it's a 50-50, but it only does 1 damage. So again, it's going to be based on your decision of what's inside this zone. Well, how much of what's inside this zone do I want to target and want to kill? You're again shooting from range, so there's targeting priority involved, but that's where the strategy comes in of choosing your type of shot. So scatter shot is more for hitting multiple enemies with low damage numbers. So standard walkers, for instance. You have the grape shot, which only uses 3 dice, but at this point your accuracy is still 4+, so 4, 5, and 6 is a hit. You're doing damage of 2 now. So now you're ticking up in terms of what types of orcs that you can actually kill off the board, so this is a little bit more of a powerful shot. Or you can go down to a boulder, which is a single die, has an accuracy of 4+, so again 50-50, but it has a damage of 3, allowing you to actually take down full abominations with this particular trebuchet. It's by far the most powerful attack, but you only get a single boulder, of course. The other option that you have when shooting with the trebuchet at any other orcs on the board, especially because no line of sight matters there, you can actually fire your trebuchet off of the scenario board and into the area where the horde is actually gathering. In other words, if you have a massive horde that is really, really piling up here and it's getting a little scary because you know you need to thin it out because at some point it will show up on a spawn point, you can choose to actually fire your trebuchet from the game board here, which is where the trebuchet will stand or sit for the majority of the game, and actually take down some of the zombies or orc zombies on this particular tile. You basically treat it as one full zone, and of course targeting priorities still apply. Next up, let's talk about the new terrain within Green Horde. So first off, we got barriers. That's this thing right here. This is considered a barrier. You can place it depending on the scenario as well as the game rules specifically. There's rules for applying this to the game board and where you should put it or where you can put it. So always reference your scenario that you're playing as well as the rulebook to determine where to place those. What are the purposes of barriers? Well, barriers are going to separate 2 zones. As you can see here, it breaks up these 2 zones. Mainly, it's going to prevent move actions through them. That's kind of the main purpose. It doesn't block line of sight, and survivors can't obviously move through a barrier because if I did, I'd be gorging myself, which you cannot do in this game. But I can fire through them or use skills like jump to clear them. So if I had jump, I could just hop over it. So certain heroes will have the ability to do that. The majority won't be able to jump. In most cases, if this character had a ranged weapon, I could easily target this particular orc zombie and make an attack against it. So what happens when an orc zombie actually encounters a barrier? How did they actually act? So if a zombie encounters a barrier, so if this zombie was activating and it was in this location at this point in time, they're going to attempt to reroute around it if they can. So if there is a way for them to get around, they'll do it, because they're not going to try to break down a barrier if there is a route or a successful path that will get them to the survivor they're trying to go after, or the noise level. Again, you're going to have to read in the rules about the order of operations separately. This rule video will not be talking about how the orcs actually move based on actually hearing and line of sight and all that kind of stuff, but it's a very important thing to get familiar with. But the majority of people that have played Zombicide already have that nailed down pretty well. So again, if this orc actually happens to encounter this barrier, we'll try to find an alternate route around. If it can't and it activates here, and there's no way for this guy to get over here, it will then go ahead and activate and destroy the barrier, taking it off the game board. And of course, if this one happened to be a runner, if it had 2 activations, it could not only destroy it, but it could also walk in. Now this guy here, if I'm not mistaken, is just a standard walker, so be aware of that. But what I wanted to mention also is that some quests are going to have additional rules regarding barriers that will make them even more specific, or there might be certain gameplay elements involving these things. So be sure to read your scenario to ensure that you're playing those barriers correctly. Now, hedges are a totally different element within Zombicide Green Horde. Hedges are the inverse of barriers, so they block line of sight for all actors unless you happen to be in a tower. In other words, you can actually have line of sight on everything, because if you're in a perched up tower, there are actual tiles that have staircases lifting you up where you essentially would be able to see at a higher level. If you're in a tower, in this particular case, then you would be able to see everything on the game board at that particular point, and then anyone that moves through a hedge and stuff like that would not be affected by what is a nasty spawn, potentially, by moving through a hedge without having anyone seeing the zone that you're moving into. So that will make more sense in a second here as I explain this. But essentially, when a survivor crosses a hedge blindly, so in this case, there's no one high up on a perch or anywhere that they can go to basically see everything from a high level. So if I cross the survivor over here, I'd be doing so blindly, because none of my heroes can see this space. When this happens, you're going to roll a d6. If it happens to land a 1, which it didn't, I'd be safe. That's okay. That was a good move, and it worked out for me. But if I happen to land a 1, in this case the zombie skull, then an orc walker would trigger, or actually, sorry, if you actually get a 1, an orc walker would spawn on that particular spot. And if you happen to run out of minis, this can actually trigger extra activations. So if you really get down in your miniatures, this whole hedge jumping can actually trigger, it's really effective to get around the board quicker and get you through some shortcuts throughout the map. You can see there's a bunch of them up here, but they could cost you extra activations if you run out of miniatures, and that's never a good thing. The next change in Zombicide Green Horde is the Waterhole positions on the streets. This is pretty cool, and it gives you some new gameplay elements that happen on the streets. The one thing you have to note is that you cannot search in these areas, of course, and most searching involves being inside of a building anyway, so that's just a reminder that you cannot search inside of these bodies of water. So first off, they're going to be, they're flooded. They're considered flooded tiles or flooded zones, and they usually connect to dry ground zones, which are either considered banks or ledges. And this is important to note. It's not just a straight-on bank all the time. There can be ledges here. So you'll see here that this is kind of a nice gradual drop down into this water area. So this is considered a bank. It's not a ledge. If it's a bank, it's smooth, it's a gradual passage from a dry section to a water hole, and on maps they basically look like a shore. So you can see it kind of just doesn't wash all the way up, and it's not dark and stuff like that. If I go over to this side, you'll see this is a ledge. It actually indicates it by having a very dark line so that you know if you drop down into this water hole, you've just crossed over a ledge. And ledges are steep drops or climb between a dry zone and a water hole zone. Alright, so now we know what water holes zones look like. Let's talk about how we actually move through them as a survivor. And of course, zombies can actually run into this as well, so we'll talk about how zombies interact with water holes too. First off, if you're a survivor and you're inside of a water zone already, you always spend 1 additional action to move to another water zone. So if you're moving from a water zone to another water zone, then you are going to, or you're leaving a water zone to another water zone, it's going to cost you that extra action. Think of it thematically as having waist-deep water surrounding you. It's taking you a little longer, more exertion. You're spending that extra action to exert yourself because you're just going to cost 2 actions to get here. It's not as simple as being on a street and just moving. Of course, this barricade wouldn't be, or not the barricade, but the bush would not be able to be here. But if it was here, a normal movement of 1 is like this on regular streets. But once you get into the water hole scenario, this is going to cost you 2. All right, number 2, through a bank. So if you move through a bank, so if you're leaving a waterhole zone, so say for instance I'm here and I'm leaving from the waterhole to a land portion, as long as there's a bank, it's just one action to get out. Because it's a nice smooth transition out of the water, no issues there. If I was on this side here in this waterhole and I was trying to get up over this ledge, that's going to cause some exertion. It's going to cost you an extra action point to get out. So 2 action points to jump up or climb up this ledge. That just makes thematic sense. The one thing that gets a little bit confusing is you'll notice sometimes there's these really weird white bank on either side of a tile. Like 2 edges of a tile have banks showing, but then they kind of come together and it gives you this nice white effect. It almost looks like you've got a kind of a bank to actually be on top of this one. You might think, oh, okay, if I was here and I started my activation, I could spend 1 action and go here because there's a bank, just like I did here. When there's a bank, you can just easily jump up. That's not the case. This is considered a water zone still, or water hole zone. This is also still called a water hole zone, and just because you have 2 banks in the middle that are touching each other does not mean that you get a 1 action move. This is still going to cost you 2 actions to move across, regardless, because you're moving from one water hole zone to another. There's a lot of talk about this on the forums. Some people are kind of overruling it, saying, no, you can be here, you can activate and move. This will cost you 2, obviously, and then when you get to here, you do 1 and continue on. That doesn't make sense to me. I think there's just a little bit of confusion with how they design the actual tiles, because they needed to have banks on the edges of the tiles for when you're forming different scenarios. So this kind of imperfection or imperfection line is going to be there at times, but just think of it as, the best way that I've thought about it is think of it as like a white cap to the ocean where 2 currents are kind of banging up against each other, and then all of a sudden you just automatically forget that that's even a bank, and you'll just treat it as waterhole zones all the way along. So as you can see here, if you jumped into the waterhole zone from here, you would be basically going all the way down there to the very, very end. It's all water, that whole thing, regardless of these white imperfections in between. So that's an easy way to remember it. Now let's talk about the zombies and how they move. So if a zombie happens to be in a waterhole zone and they want to move to another waterhole zone, there's no penalty. So zombies can move through water pretty easily. Probably mostly because they've lost a lot of body weight, and they're basically just moving through as they're basically a pile of bones or just decrepit. And they also have better movement, I guess. So for the purpose of the game, mechanic-wise, they move better through water. They don't have that penalty. Of course, if they did have a penalty, they wouldn't be moving very fast, if ever. Through a bank, no penalty. So just like the survivors, if they're moving through a bank onto dry land, no penalty whatsoever to do that. That just makes common sense. And then if you're going through a ledge, zombies can't leave through a ledge. They have to select another route. So this is where survivors can have zombies kind of chasing them down, and if you get to a certain point where you're here and the zombie is here, thematically as well as strategically, you can use some of your actions to jump on this ledge, and at this point this zombie no longer can come after you. It's almost like you've left him in a deep enough water hole. He doesn't have the agility or the athletics to get up there and get you. Now he's going to have to try to find, and based on your his activation moves and how he prioritizes his targets based on the sound and sight and everything else that we're familiar with Zombicide, he has to find a different route to try to get around to find you. So it might mean going over here and getting up on shore and coming over here and trying to find a way. But in some cases, he may not even be able to do that. So this is a nice way thematically for the survivors to get out of harm's way really quick. It's very, very useful and can also be helpful, I guess, with abominations. Couple minor things to note about water holes here. So some other things that are very important is if you have a speed cast on you, which is a spell, you ignore water hole effects, or if you have that ability. Siege engines are immediately destroyed when they are moved into a water hole zone, as we talked about before. So if for whatever weird reason you decide to actually move using 3 actions with your unit into a water hole, you've automatically destroyed your trebuchet. So don't do that. It's not a good idea. And just try to keep the trebuchet maybe away from water. There might be game effects that actually move it, or monsters that pull it, or things like that. Again, it's not considered an actor, so that might not happen very often. I haven't experienced it myself, but those of you that have played the game can maybe let us know. Is there a chance that a trebuchet sitting here could potentially be pushed or knocked into water and destroyed? I don't know if that's possible. Maybe it is. The other thing you want to make mention of is that, of course, dragon fire has no effect on water hole zones. So you can't go ahead and try to put your dragon bile down here and try to start a fire to kill an abomination. It just doesn't make thematic sense. You're starting a fire in a water hole. So that is not allowed. Actors moving from a dry zone to a water zone or water hole zone, whether it's a bank or a ledge, follow the normal movement rules without any special limitations. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up. That is the rules video for Zombicide Green Horde, and I am really excited. We've got 4 Stranger Things characters characters. We'll talk more about that. We're going to talk about the scenario in the next one as well when we begin the playthrough. I'm adding a little bit of a twist into this tutorial. We're going to have actually a search for one of our Stranger Things characters. So right now we have 4. We're going to try to find William or Will. Now, if you're familiar with the TV show, there's some spoiler stuff going on here, but I'm not going to go any further and talk about it. But we are trying to find Will here. That is going to be the goal. Now, there's a couple new skills I want to mention. Even though I don't have them here in front of me, I'm just going to name them off so you can go reference them if you want to know some new skills that came in with Green Horde that are not in Black Plague. They are Battle Rage, Brother in Arms, Double Casting, and Transmutation. Those are the 4 new skills. Again, with typical skills, you don't usually bother to look them up or reference them until they actually affect your character or maybe some game event or game mechanic. So again, don't bother looking them up necessarily unless you really feel like you want to. For reference purposes, it's almost better to look them up if your character happens to have it as maybe an ability or something like this and it comes into play later. But this should do it. This is really going to be your reference of what's new in Green Horde, what's worth focusing in on for rules. Of course, if you go find a Black Plague rule set video, then you're going to have everything you need in order to get Zombicide to the table. I wanted to keep this streamlined for just the new changes because the majority of us have played an iteration of Zombicide before and understand the general rules, and they typically don't change the general movement of rules, but they always adapt and add in some new changes every iteration. Even Invader, which is coming up soon, which is a sci-fi version of this, basically is going to have some rule changes already. That'll be similar to the number that happened here in Green Horde from Black Plague. So, all that said, we've covered the bases, and we're now ready to move on to the playthrough of the showcase. So I'm really happy to be moving into that. I cannot wait to see whether our 4 survivors from Stranger Things are going to be able to handle the abominations that are going to be coming at us. I've got some things to talk about with the spawn deck that I'm going to mention at the beginning of the playthrough. So I can't wait to see you there. Hope this was useful. Thanks so much for your support, and as always, keep on rolling solo.